Sometimes, the most terrifying things in this world don't lurk in the dark corners of abandoned buildings or in the shadows of back alleys. Sometimes they sit right next to you at the dinner table. They smile at you from family photos. They wave from the front porch. Tonight, we're going to talk about families that, from the outside, appeared to be perfectly normal, but behind their closed doors hid secrets so dark, so incomprehensible, that when the truth finally surfaced, the world could barely process what it was hearing. In Paris, California, about 70 miles southeast of Los Angeles, there sat an unremarkable one-story house on a quiet suburban street called Muir Woods Road. The kind of street where sprinklers click on at dawn and garage doors hum shut in the evening. The kind of place where nothing ever seems to happen. And for years, if you happened to drive past that particular house, you might not have noticed anything strange at all. Sometimes you might catch a glimpse of matching outfits, children lined up neatly by age, quiet and obedient, but nothing that screamed danger. Nothing that would make you slow your car or pick up the phone. David and Louise Turpin had 13 children, all biological, born between 1988 and 2015. 10 daughters and 3 sons. On their Facebook page, the family looked like an oversized but cheerful American household. There were pictures from Disneyland, where the Turpins had annual passes. There were photos from Las Vegas, where David and Louise renewed their wedding vows not once, not twice, but 3 separate times at a chapel staffed by an Elvis impersonator. In those pictures and videos, the boys wore dark matching suits and the girls wore identical purple plaid dresses and white shoes. They stood in neat rows. They smiled. The Elvis impersonator who married them remembered the children as quiet and well-behaved, and later said the family appeared to be nothing other than a big group that loved doing everything together. But behind that carefully curated facade, something monstrous was happening. David Turpin had graduated from Virginia Tech and worked as a computer engineer, pulling in a salary of around $140,000 a year at Northrop Grumman. Louise was listed as a homemaker. They met when David was 23 and Louise was just 16 at Princeton High School in West Virginia. They married in Pearisburg, Virginia in 1985 and originally identified as devout Pentecostal Christians. Relatives said they believed God had called on them to have as many children as possible. The family first lived in Fort Worth, Texas, before moving to the small town of Rio Vista, Texas in 1999. It was there that some of the earliest known signs of severe dysfunction emerged. In 2007, the Turpin parents moved 10 of their children into an isolated trailer on the property. David and Louise then took only the 2 youngest and left the remaining 10 to essentially fend for themselves, returning only periodically with groceries that were never enough to feed everyone. One of the daughters, Jordan, who was 6 years old at the time, later recalled that there was a lot of starving and that she had resorted to eating ketchup, mustard, or ice just to put something in her stomach. When the family eventually vacated that Rio Vista property in 2010, neighbors who entered the home found feces smeared on the walls, beds with ropes tied to them, dead cats, and heaps of garbage piled throughout the house. In 2014, the family moved to Paris, California, and what had already been deeply disturbing neglect escalated into something far worse. But somewhere along the way, whatever faith or love may have once existed in that household curdled into something deeply, irredeemably cruel. For years, David and Louise Turpin imprisoned their own children. They beat them. They strangled them. They allowed them to eat just 1 meal a day and to bathe only once a year. What began as what prosecutors later described as neglect eventually escalated into severe, calculated, systematic torture. The children were chained to their beds with padlocks when they misbehaved, and the punishments would last weeks, sometimes months at a time. At first, the parents used ropes, but when one child managed to wriggle free, they upgraded to chains and locks purchased from a hardware store. The house was dark and foul-smelling. Circumstantial evidence suggested the children were often not even released from their chains to use the bathroom. The children were homeschooled through a private school David registered with the state called the Sandcastle Day School, which existed only on paper. The oldest child had technically only completed the 3rd grade. Many of the children had such limited vocabularies that they didn't understand basic concepts. One of the daughters, Jordan, later admitted she didn't even know what the word medication meant. Some of the children didn't know what a police officer was. They were, in the truest sense of the word, cut off from the real world, and physically, the damage was devastating. The 29-year-old Jennifer weighed just 82 pounds. A 12-year-old child had an arm circumference equivalent to that of a 4-month-old baby. 7 of the adult children appeared so small and underfed that when police finally arrived, officers initially believed they were all minors. Their muscles were wasting, their growth was stunted, their bodies had been starved of the most basic things a human being needs to survive and develop. One of the most disturbing details was how David and Louise would taunt the children. Pies would be left sitting on the kitchen counter where the starving kids could see them, but were forbidden to touch. The couple bought toys and food for themselves, but denied the children any enrichment, any comfort, any sense of normalcy. The 2 Maltese dogs found in the house, by contrast, appeared perfectly healthy, likely better cared for than the human beings living under the same roof. Yet the outside world saw only what the Turpins wanted them to see. Their relatives noted that the family posted happy pictures on Facebook and talked lovingly about their trips together. One of Louise's aunts later admitted that the photos had made her think they were one big happy family. Even the couple's bankruptcy lawyer recalled that the Turpins spoke lovingly of their children and even showed him Disneyland photos during a meeting. A neighbor named Kimberly Milligan recalled one rare encounter in 2015 when she spotted some of the older Turpin children setting up a nativity scene in the front yard. She complimented them on their decorations, and the children instantly froze. They shut down completely, she remembered, their faces going blank with a kind of terror she could feel even from a distance. It was as though they had learned to make themselves invisible, as though their only defense against the world was to simply not be there. Milligan said she never saw the children outside again after that. She never heard them playing in the backyard. The parents struck her as standoffish, but not in a mean way, and she found herself thinking this was just a very private family that did things differently. In retrospect, that instinct to mind her own business haunted her. It wasn't until January 14th, 2018, that the walls of that carefully constructed lie finally came crashing down. 17-year-old Jordan Turpin, who appeared to be no older than 10, crawled out of a window in the dead of night using a deactivated cell phone she had secretly kept hidden from her parents. For more than 2 years, she and her siblings had been planning an escape, and that night, knowing her parents were about to move the family to Oklahoma, she decided it was now or never. Another sister initially escaped with her, but grew too frightened and turned back. Jordan made the call alone. When she reached a 911 dispatcher, her voice was shaking. She told the operator her parents were abusive, that her 2 little sisters were chained to their beds at that very moment, and that the family lived in filth so thick she sometimes couldn't breathe. She couldn't even tell the dispatcher her own address and had to read it from a piece of paper. When officers arrived at the house, they found a scene that the Riverside County District Attorney would later call among the worst, most aggravated child abuse cases he had ever seen. Louise Turpin, upon seeing police at the door, appeared perplexed as to why they were even there. David and Louise were each charged with 12 counts of torture, 12 counts of false imprisonment, and numerous other felony counts. In February 2019, both parents pleaded guilty and were sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. But the tragedy didn't end with their arrest. In a heartbreaking twist, 5 of the minor Turpin children were placed into foster care with the Olguin family, who were later arrested for abusing the children all over again. The foster parents allegedly hit the children with sandals, pulled their hair, forced them to eat their own vomit, and made them sit in a circle and recount the trauma from their birth parents' home. The foster father was eventually sentenced to 7 years in prison for his crimes, including lewd acts on a child. The system that was supposed to save the Turpin children had failed them twice. And yet, even in the midst of that unimaginable suffering, some of the Turpin children found the strength to offer words of grace at their parents' sentencing. One daughter said she loved her parents and had forgiven them. A son admitted he still had nightmares, but said the past was the past. Jordan, the brave girl who had escaped and saved her siblings, later became an advocate and spoke publicly about rebuilding her life. Their resilience, born from a suffering most people will never comprehend, remains one of the most extraordinary aspects of this entire case. What the Turpin case exposed was a terrifying truth about the power of image, about how easily a family can hide unspeakable evil behind matching outfits and vacation photos. But the Turpins were hardly the only family to weaponize appearances, and their story finds a chilling echo in a case from the other side of the world that predates theirs by decades. In the quiet town of Amstetten in Lower Austria, there stood a house at Ybbstrasse 40 that, from the street, looked like any other modest European home. Neighbors knew the man who lived there, Josef Fritzl, as a somewhat stern but otherwise unremarkable property developer and engineer. His wife Rosemarie was a quiet woman. They had several children, and while Joseph kept to himself, no one would have described the household as anything more than private. But beneath that house, behind 8 locked doors and a 500-kilogram reinforced hatch, lay a windowless dungeon measuring roughly 600 square feet that Joseph had spent years constructing in secret. And within that dungeon, for 24 years, he imprisoned his own daughter. Elizabeth Fritzl was born in 1966, the 4th of Joseph and Rosemarie's 7 children. Joseph himself had grown up in deeply traumatic circumstances. His father, also named Joseph, was a severe alcoholic who deserted the family when Joseph Jr. was just 4 years old. His mother, Maria, raised him alone and allegedly subjected him to years of physical and emotional abuse. Whether that background explains or merely contextualizes what Joseph became is a question psychologists have debated for years, but what is not debatable is the trajectory of his cruelty. According to later testimony, Joseph first began sexually abusing Elizabeth when she was just 11 years old. By the time she became a teenager, Elizabeth had started running away from home for short periods, which meant that when she vanished permanently in August 1984 at the age of 18, few were entirely shocked. Joseph told his wife and the authorities that Elizabeth had likely run off to join a religious cult, a story he reinforced by forcing Elizabeth, already imprisoned below the house, to write letters in her own handwriting that he would then mail from various post offices around Austria. Rosemarie hastily filed a missing persons report, and Elizabeth's name was even placed on an Interpol watch list. But the investigation went nowhere. Joseph had been convincingly calm. He shrugged his shoulders. He said she'd talked about cults before, and everyone believed him. On August 28, 1984, Joseph had lured Elizabeth into the cellar under the pretense of needing help installing a door. Once she was inside, he pressed an ether-soaked cloth over her face until she lost consciousness, then handcuffed her and locked her inside the soundproof chamber he had built for this exact purpose. For the next 24 years, Joseph descended into that basement and raped his daughter thousands of times. He used chains and restraints to control her movement. He withheld food as punishment, and over the course of her imprisonment, Elizabeth gave birth to 7 children, all fathered by Joseph, without any medical assistance whatsoever. 3 of those children, Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix, were kept in the basement with their mother and never saw daylight for their entire lives growing up. 3 others, Lisa, Monica, and Alexander, were secretly brought upstairs by Joseph, who placed them on the family's doorstep and told Rosemarie that Elizabeth had dropped them off because she couldn't care for them while in the cult. Joseph convinced both his wife and Austrian social services that this was true, and he and Rosemarie formally fostered the children. A 7th child, a boy named Michael, died shortly after birth, and Joseph cremated his body in the furnace upstairs. The cellar contained a tiny kitchen, a bathroom, and 3 cramped sleeping areas. There was a television, a radio, and a refrigerator, which Joseph used not out of kindness, but as instruments of control, rewarding or punishing the captives as he saw fit. The ceiling was so low that Stefan, by the time he reached adulthood, walked with a permanent stoop because he could never stand fully upright. Kirsten lost all of her teeth. 5-year-old Felix preferred crawling to walking because the cramped space was all he had ever known. The children who lived in the basement suffered from severe vitamin D deficiency, anemia, and a host of other conditions caused by never once being exposed to natural light. Rosemarie would later insist she had no idea what was happening in her own basement, a claim that many people, then and now, found difficult to believe. Tenants who rented rooms in the house reported hearing strange noises from below, which Joseph explained away as faulty pipes or the heating system. He visited the cellar every morning, ostensibly to work on engineering plans, and his wife was forbidden from bringing him coffee. He sometimes stayed the entire night. The horror finally came to light in April 2008, when Kirsten, then 19, fell critically ill with kidney failure. Elizabeth desperately pleaded with her father to let the young woman receive medical attention. Joseph relented, carrying Kirsten out of the cellar and calling an ambulance, but he brought a note he claimed was from Kirsten's absent mother. Hospital doctors, unable to find any medical records for the young woman, appealed on television for her mother to come forward. Under increasing pressure, Joseph eventually brought Elizabeth out of the cellar for the first time in 24 years. She was brought to the hospital, where staff immediately grew suspicious. That evening, Austrian police took Elizabeth into custody for questioning. It took hours, and a solemn promise from investigators that she would never have to see her father again, before Elizabeth was finally able to tell the full story of her 24-year captivity. Joseph was arrested on April 26, 2008. He was 73 years old. Even after his arrest, his statements revealed a chilling detachment. He told his lawyer that he had always known what he was doing was wrong, that he must have been crazy, and yet it had become a kind of normal routine for him to lead a double life in the cellar of his own house. He described himself not as a monster, but as someone who had committed monstrous acts, a distinction that many found as disturbing as the crimes themselves. At trial in March 2009, he was charged with incest, rape, coercion, false imprisonment, enslavement, and the negligent murder of baby Michael, whose death he had caused by failing to seek medical care for the newborn. After viewing Elizabeth's videotape testimony, Joseph changed his plea to guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. The aftermath for Elizabeth and her children was a long, painful road of recovery. The basement children had to be slowly introduced to sunlight, nutritious food, and open spaces. Kirsten, who had nearly died from kidney failure, required extensive dental treatment because she had lost all of her teeth. Stefan had developed a permanent stoop from years of being unable to stand upright. 5-year-old Felix preferred crawling on the ground because the cramped basement was all the world he had ever known. Elizabeth herself, at 42, looked decades older than she was, her face lined and her posture hunched. European doctors who examined her found horrific dental decay, vitamin D deficiency so severe it risked causing rickets, and a host of other ailments stemming from never having seen the sun in over 2 decades. Today, well into his late 80s and reportedly suffering from dementia, Josef Fritzl remains behind bars, though a 2024 court ruling determined he could potentially be moved to a regular prison. None of his family members have visited him during his imprisonment. Elizabeth and her surviving children moved to an undisclosed village where they have built new, private lives far from the spotlight. The Fritzl case horrified the world not just because of the scale of the abuse, but because of how it thrived in plain sight. An entire family, a neighborhood, and a government all failed to notice a woman imprisoned beneath their feet for nearly a quarter century. And that same cruel paradox, that evil can fester for decades while the world watches and sees nothing, was playing out in England at almost the same time. For years, 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester, England, looked like just another narrow, lived-in terrace house on a busy urban block. Tenants came and went. Children played out front. Neighbors saw a busy household and thought nothing of it. But beneath the floors and under the garden of that address, the remains of young women were decomposing in shallow graves, placed there by a husband and wife killing team whose crimes would eventually be recognized as among the most depraved in British criminal history. Fred West was born in 1941 in the village of Mouchmarkel, Herefordshire, and by all accounts grew up in a deeply dysfunctional household. He met Rosemary Letts in 1969, when he was 27 and she was just 15. Despite the age gap and Fred's existing criminal record, including a conviction for having relations with a minor, the two quickly became inseparable. They married in 1972 at the Gloucester Register office with no family present except Fred's brother John. By then, Rosemary was already pregnant with their second child, and the couple moved into 25 Cromwell Street. Together, Fred and Rose West would go on to murder at least 12 young women and girls between 1967 and 1987. Their victims included runaways, hitchhikers, tenants, and even members of their own family. Fred's first victim is believed to have been Anne McFall, a nanny he employed in 1967, while still married to his first wife, Catherine Costello. McFall was pregnant, possibly with Fred's child, when she was murdered. Her dismembered body was discovered decades later in a shallow grave near a cluster of trees, Catherine herself was also killed, believed strangled, possibly in the back seat of Fred's car. And then there was Charmaine, Catherine's daughter and Fred's stepdaughter, who was just 8 years old when she disappeared in 1971 while in Rose's care during one of Fred's stretches in prison. Her remains were later found buried beneath the kitchen floor of the couple's previous address on Midland Road. The couple also killed their own eldest daughter, Heather, who vanished in June 1987 at the age of 16. Heather had begun to show signs of rebelliousness and had reportedly threatened to tell people what was going on inside the house. Fred later dismembered her body and buried it beneath the patio in the back garden. For years afterward, if the West children misbehaved, their parents would warn them they'd end up under the patio like their sister. It was treated as a dark family joke, something the children repeated at school without fully understanding its weight, and something that adults around them dismissed as childish nonsense for far too long. Among the other victims were young women targeted specifically because of their vulnerability. Lucy Partington was a 21-year-old university student who vanished while walking to a bus stop in 1973. Carol Ann Cooper was just 15, a runaway from a children's home. Shirley Hubbard had been living with foster parents when she disappeared. Juanita Mott was 18 and had been staying at 25 Cromwell Street before she went missing. And Shirley Robinson, who was 8 months pregnant with Fred's child, was killed after Rose grew resentful of Fred's relationship with the young woman. Her body, along with the remains of her unborn baby, was buried in the garden. The basement of 25 Cromwell Street had been converted into what investigators would later describe as a torture chamber. Victims were abducted or lured to the house, where they were subjected to unimaginable sexual violence, bound with ropes and tape, and eventually killed. Fred constructed wooden beams in the cellar ceiling specifically designed for suspending victims' bodies. After killing each woman, he would dismember the remains, removing fingers, toes, and kneecaps, and bury the body parts in shallow, cube-shaped graves beneath the cellar floor or in the garden. When space in the cellar ran out, he moved to the garden. All of this happened while the West children attended school, while tenants lived upstairs, while neighbors walked past the house every single day. The couple had 10 children between them, some of whom were fathered not by Fred, but by the many men Rose entertained as part of a sex work operation Fred encouraged her to run from within the home. The children grew up in a household defined by violence, sexual exploitation, and terror. Several of the West children were themselves victims of sexual abuse by their parents. The beginning of the end came when the West children, now placed partially in social care, made offhand remarks to social workers. They mentioned that if they misbehaved, they'd end up under the patio like their sister Heather. The comments were initially dismissed, but by 1994, social workers and police took them seriously enough to obtain a warrant to search the property. When officers arrived and began digging, Fred initially denied everything, calling the claims about Heather rubbish. But the very next day, with police still on his property, Fred changed his story. He told investigators he had killed Heather, but they were digging in the wrong place. From there, the confessions came in waves. Fred passed a handwritten note to his solicitor admitting to approximately 9 additional killings. Over the following weeks, police unearthed remains throughout the house and garden, eventually recovering parts of 12 bodies. Each victim had been extensively mutilated, and each body showed evidence of having been subjected to extreme abuse before death. Fred's confession tapes, in which he described the murders in a disturbingly casual, almost bored tone, would later be described by those who heard them as some of the most chilling recordings in British criminal history. One investigator said Fred spoke about burying his daughter as if he were talking about burying a dead hamster. Fred West took his own life in prison on New Year's Day 1995, before he could stand trial. Rose was tried alone later that year and convicted on 10 counts of murder. She was sentenced to a whole life tariff, meaning she will never be released. She remains imprisoned at HM Prison, New Hall. The house at 25 Cromwell Street was demolished in 1996, and the site was turned into a public walkway. But the memory of what happened there, and the question of whether the Wests may have had even more victims than anyone knows, continues to haunt the city of Gloucester to this day. The Wests represent one of the most extreme examples of a family masking evil behind normalcy. But across the Atlantic, another case would demonstrate that even in the age of social media, where every moment of daily life is documented and shared, it's shockingly easy for a murderer to hide in plain sight. On the surface, the Watts family of Frederick, Colorado, looked like any other young suburban family chasing the American dream. Christopher Watts and Shanann Razuchek had met through social media around 2010, married in 2012, and settled into a spacious 5-bedroom home on Saratoga Trail. They had 2 young daughters, 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste, and Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant with a baby boy they planned to name Nico. Shanann was active on social media, selling health products for a multi-level marketing company called Lavelle, and her Facebook was filled with photos of family outings, birthday parties, and messages about how much she loved her husband and girls. Chris appeared to be a doting father and supportive partner, the kind of quiet, dependable man who mowed the lawn on weekends and smiled for every camera. But in the summer of 2018, something shifted. While Shanann was away on a 6-week work trip, Chris began an affair with a coworker named Nicole Kessinger. When Shanann returned, she confided in friends that Chris seemed different, distant, and cold. He had told her they weren't compatible anymore. Friends were confused. Just weeks earlier, the couple had appeared happy. Chris had even smiled broadly on camera when Shanann surprised him with the news of her 3rd pregnancy. In the early morning hours of August 13th, 2018, Shanann returned home from a work trip in Arizona. A friend and coworker dropped her off around 1:48 in the morning. Chris was waiting inside. What happened next, by Chris's own later confession, was that the couple got into an argument about their marriage, and Chris strangled Shanann to death with his bare hands. Prosecutors would later emphasize that there were no defensive injuries on Shanann's body, meaning the strangulation was not the product of a chaotic struggle, but a deliberate act that lasted at least 2 minutes. At some point during or after the murder, 4-year-old Bella walked into the bedroom. She saw her mother's body and asked what was wrong with Mommy. Chris told her Shanann was sick. He then loaded Shanann's body into the bed of his work truck, placed both living girls in the back seat without car seats, and drove to a remote oil field operated by his employer, Anadarko Petroleum. At the site, he smothered 3-year-old Celeste first, pushing her small body through an 8-inch opening into a crude oil storage tank. When he returned to the truck, Bella, who had been watching, asked in a soft, trembling voice whether the same thing was going to happen to her as had happened to Cece. Chris told investigators that the last words his daughter ever spoke were "Daddy, no." He then smothered her and forced her body into a second oil tank. He buried Shanann in a shallow grave nearby. The next day, when Shanann's friend Nicole Atkinson couldn't reach her, and grew concerned enough to call the police, Chris stood on the front porch of his family home and gave a television interview that would become one of the most analyzed moments in modern true crime. Looking directly into the camera with an almost rehearsed calm, he pleaded for his family's safe return. He said the house wasn't complete without them. He called their disappearance earth-shattering. But body language experts and investigators immediately noticed something off. His expressions were flat. He showed no real distress. When reviewing his own home security footage showing Shanann arriving home, Chris barely glanced at the screen, repeatedly looking away and checking his phone. Within 2 days, investigators discovered his affair. They administered a polygraph test, which he failed spectacularly. He then confessed to his father, and subsequently to police. But even in that initial confession, he lied, claiming that Shanann had killed the girls and he had strangled her in a rage. It wasn't until months later, in a February 2019 prison interview with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, that Chris admitted the full truth. He had killed all 3 of them. He said he now keeps photos of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste on the wall of his prison cell and reads to them every night. Chris Watts was sentenced to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 84 years for the unlawful termination of Shanann's pregnancy and tampering with the bodies. He was transferred to a maximum security prison in Wisconsin due to safety concerns. During his sentencing, the judge called the case the most inhumane crime he had seen in his 17 years on the bench. Shanann's mother, Sandy Rzucek, addressed Chris directly in the courtroom and told him they had loved him like a son, that they had trusted him, and that his own daughter once sang him a song that went, "Daddy, you're my hero." The family chose not to seek the death penalty, with Sandy explaining that she didn't want death for Chris because that decision was between him and God. In later prison interviews, Chris revealed additional disturbing details. He admitted that he had actually planned the murders for weeks, not acted in a moment of rage as he had initially implied. He confessed that the oxycodone found in Shanann's system was something he had given her, hoping to end her pregnancy because he believed it would make it easier for him to be with his girlfriend. He also admitted that he had first attempted to smother his daughters in their beds at home but was unsuccessful, meaning those little girls endured not 1 but 2 separate attempts on their lives that night before their father finally killed them at the oil field. The case became the subject of the Netflix documentary American Murder: The Family Next Door, and continues to fascinate and horrify the public in equal measure. Perhaps what makes the Watts case so uniquely disturbing is how thin the mask was. This was a man who murdered his entire family, went to work the next day within feet of where their bodies lay, and then went on television and pretended to be a worried husband and father. The disconnect between the image and the reality was a void so wide it was almost incomprehensible. But while the cases we've discussed so far involved families hiding their crimes from the outside world, the next story involves a family whose darkest secret was the family itself. A bloodline so tangled and so damaged that by the time authorities finally intervened, the harm had been compounding for generations. In July of 2012, police and child protection officers in New South Wales, Australia, drove a convoy of vehicles up an old stock route on the outskirts of a small farming town called Burowa, about 3.5 hours southwest of Sydney. They were following up on reports that had been trickling in since 2010, reports about children who didn't go to school, who appeared malnourished, and who seemed to live in conditions far removed from anything resembling modern civilization. What they found in a clearing in the bush that day would shock even the most hardened investigators. Nearly 40 people were living in a makeshift camp of tents, caravans, and shacks, surrounded by garbage and lacking running water, electricity, or any form of sanitation. The children were filthy, shy, and largely incapable of intelligible speech. Many appeared developmentally delayed. Some had misaligned eyes or low-set ears, physical markers that would later be confirmed as the result of generations of inbreeding. The concept of personal hygiene, of toothbrushes and showers and toilets, was entirely foreign to them. This was the Colt family, a court-appointed pseudonym used to protect the identities of the children involved. The origins of the Colt clan trace back to New Zealand, where a brother and sister entered into a relationship that produced a daughter named June, born in 1948. June later married a man called Tim, who was not a blood relative, and the couple emigrated to Australia in the 1970s. They had 7 children together. But the incestuous patterns that had begun with June's own parents continued and intensified. Tim fathered children not only with June, but also with at least 2 of his own daughters. One of those daughters, Betty, entered into a long-term relationship with her younger brother, Charlie, and together they had 12 children. Other pairings within the family included father-daughter, brother-sister, uncle-niece, and even grandparent-grandchild couplings. The family moved frequently across South Australia, Western Australia, and Victoria before settling in New South Wales, likely to avoid detection. They were a self-contained unit, rarely interacting with the outside world. Some townspeople in Boorowa had seen members of the odd family when they drove in for supplies on a 4-wheeler, but nobody suspected the scale of what was happening. Genetic testing later confirmed that 11 of the 12 children removed from the property were the products of incestuous unions. 8 had parents who were either siblings or parent and child. 6 had parents who were aunt and nephew or uncle and niece. The physical and psychological consequences were devastating. Some children suffered from conditions linked directly to inbreeding, including a rare disorder called Zellweger syndrome. Several were deaf or partially blind. Many had significant intellectual disabilities. When placed in foster care, the children initially exhibited deeply disturbing, sexualized behavior toward one another and toward their carers, though these habits faded with time and proper care. 5 of the boys removed from the property admitted to torturing animals on the farm, including puppies and cats, and confessed to mutilating the genitals of animals as a pastime. The girls on the farm endured a particular kind of suffering. Reports indicated that some were tied to trees and raped by male relatives. Pregnancies were common, but were concealed, with the girls sometimes miscarrying on the property. When children were born, paternity was often falsely attributed to outsiders, tourists, or temporary workers, to deflect suspicion. The women in the family, including Betty and her sisters, later denied that their children were the products of incest, even when DNA evidence proved otherwise. Criminal proceedings against the Colt family were protracted and complicated. 8 family members were ultimately charged, including Betty, Charlie, and several of June's grandchildren. Charges ranged from incest and child sexual abuse to perjury about the paternity of their children. Sentences varied. Some charges were dropped. Betty was convicted in 2014 for attempting to kidnap her son from foster care and for sending him sexually explicit text messages. After serving her sentence, she fought deportation to New Zealand. As recently as the early 2020s, reports surfaced that some Colt family members, now freed, were found living together again, raising fears that the cycle had never truly ended. And while the Colt case exposed the horrors of isolation and generational abuse in the Australian bush, thousands of miles away, on the opposite side of the globe, an eerily similar story had been festering for even longer, hidden in the wooded hills of eastern Canada. On South Mountain in Nova Scotia, near the small farming town of Wolfville, there existed a community of families that most people in the surrounding Annapolis Valley knew only through whispers and cruel jokes. The Goler clan, as they came to be known, lived in two dilapidated shacks in a remote, wooded area south of a community called White Rock. They were desperately poor, socially isolated, and for generations had existed on the margins of Canadian society, surviving on welfare checks, hunting, fishing, and foraging. The family's history on South Mountain stretched back to the 19th century. Historical research revealed that the Golers descended in part from an African-American man who had fled Virginia during the Revolutionary period and settled in Nova Scotia. Over time, his descendants and other marginalized families were pushed to the margins of the Annapolis Valley, shunned by the wealthier farming communities below, and forced up onto the mountain where they had little contact with the outside world. This social exile, generation after generation, created the conditions in which the abuse that followed could take root and flourish unchecked. The adults in the Goler household had little formal education, and many were classified by later psychological evaluations as borderline intellectually disabled, their cognitive limitations compounded by what authorities would come to understand as decades, possibly a century, of inbreeding. Documents dating back to the 1860s showed that interfamily relationships had been prevalent on South Mountain, and that authorities, social workers, and local politicians had known about the high rates of birth defects and intellectual disabilities in these communities for well over 100 years without taking meaningful action. The children were forced to handle menial chores like preparing food and removing garbage, which would simply be thrown into the attic until it filled up, at which point the children were made to haul it all out. The family lived without the most basic standards of hygiene or nutrition. Their existence was defined by deprivation. But deprivation was only part of the nightmare. For generations, the children of the Goler clan were subjected to systematic sexual abuse by the adults in the family. Fathers, mothers, uncles, aunts, siblings, and cousins all participated in various forms of abuse against children as young as 5 years old. The abuse wasn't hidden from the rest of the family. It was an open, accepted part of daily life. One survivor, Donna Goler, who was removed from the household at age 11, later recalled that her father would essentially rent his children out for sexual favors, allowing other men to choose whichever child they wanted in exchange for a case of beer, a carton of cigarettes, or sometimes just a single pack. From around 1980, several of the children attempted to tell outsiders about what was happening. They went to teachers. They approached authorities. But every single time, they were disbelieved and returned to their families, where they were punished for speaking out. The isolation of South Mountain, combined with the social stigma surrounding the mountain families, created a perfect barrier of indifference. People in the valley below knew the mountain families were strange, knew something wasn't right, but the prevailing attitude was one of avoidance. These were the kind of people respectable society simply didn't engage with. It wasn't until January of 1984 that the dam finally broke. A 14-year-old girl, later identified as Sandra Goler, broke down in tears in her classroom and told a school official the truth. She revealed that her father had been forcing sexual acts on her 10 to 15 times per month. This time, someone listened. the Royal Canadian Mounted Police launched an investigation that would peel back layer after layer of horror. As detectives dug deeper, they discovered that the abuse stretched back not just years, but generations. During interrogation, several of the Goler adults not only admitted to the abuse, but boasted about it, going into graphic detail and insisting that the children had initiated the sexual contact. They were entirely unapologetic, in many cases genuinely confused about why what they had done was considered wrong. One family member, a 57-year-old man whom doctors classified as mentally disabled, told a reporter after his release from prison that he simply didn't understand what he had been incarcerated for. He was just living life the way he always had. 16 adults were ultimately charged with hundreds of allegations of incest and sexual abuse involving children as young as 5. 13 received jail sentences ranging from 1 to 7 years. The patriarch, William Dennis Goler, received the longest sentence at 7 years. But the sentences were widely criticized as inadequate given the scale and duration of the abuse. Manuscripts and records dating back to the 1860s showed that interfamily relations had been prevalent on South Mountain for over a century, and that high rates of birth defects and intellectual disabilities had been documented and ignored by authorities for just as long. The case was covered in detail in a 1998 book called On South Mountain: The Dark Secrets of the Goler Clan. Donna Goler, the girl who had been removed at 11, became an outspoken activist for stricter child abuse laws and stronger protections for vulnerable children. In a particularly grim postscript, William Dennis Goler, the main perpetrator, reoffended after his release from prison, proving that for some, no amount of punishment could break the cycle. What the Goler case demonstrated was how easily society can look away when the victims are poor, marginalized, and voiceless. The people of the Annapolis Valley had jokes about the mountain families, but no one climbed that mountain to check on the children. And this willingness to look away, this collective failure to see what is right in front of us, threads through every case we've discussed tonight. But perhaps nowhere was the gap between public image and private reality more perfectly, more devastatingly illustrated than in the story of a family that used social media, progressive politics, and the appearance of love to hide the very worst kind of cruelty. Jennifer and Sarah Hart met at Northern State University in South Dakota, where they were both studying elementary education. They fell in love and built what appeared to be a beautiful life together. In 2006, they adopted 3 siblings from foster care in Texas: 7-year-old Marcus, 4-year-old Hannah, and 2-year-old Abigail. 2 years later, they adopted 3 more siblings from Houston: 5-year-old Devonte, 4-year-old Jeremiah, and 3-year-old Sierra. All 6 children were black. Jennifer and Sarah were white. They called themselves the Hart tribe and cultivated an image of a progressive, loving, interracial family living their best life. Their social media presence was carefully curated and relentlessly positive. Jennifer's Facebook page overflowed with smiling faces, family road trips, music festivals, and outdoor adventures. The family often appeared at social justice rallies wearing matching t-shirts. They attended rallies for presidential candidate Bernie Sanders. They were, by all outward appearances, the very model of a compassionate, politically conscious 21st century family. Friends described them as magical, radiant, and inspiring. One friend later said the Harts seemed like a self-supporting unit that shattered norms and never shied away from controversy. But before adopting their 6 children, the Harts had been foster parents to a 15-year-old girl. Just 1 week before their first 3 adoptees were due to arrive, Jennifer and Sarah dropped the teenager off at a routine therapist appointment and never came back. The girl was simply abandoned without explanation. It was a chilling preview of the control and callousness that would define the Hart household. But because foster records are often sealed and fragmented across states, this red flag was never connected to their subsequent adoptions. In November 2014, one moment catapulted the Hart family into the national spotlight. During a protest in Portland, Oregon, over the police shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, 12-year-old Devante stood in the crowd holding a sign that read, "Free Hugs." He was crying. Portland Police Sergeant Brett Barnum noticed the boy, approached him, and asked if he could have one of those hugs. A freelance photographer captured the moment, a black child in tears embracing a white police officer, and the image went viral. It reached the top of Reddit. It was shared hundreds of thousands of times on Facebook. It was hailed as a symbol of hope and racial healing in a divided America. But behind that powerful image, Devante was not crying tears of civic engagement. He was a child in profound distress, raised in a household where food was weaponized, where punishment was constant, and where the carefully crafted illusion of a loving family was maintained through isolation and control. The warning signs had been there for years. In 2008, Hannah showed up at school in Minnesota with bruises on her arm and told a teacher she had been whipped with a belt. No criminal charges were filed. In 2010, Sarah Hart pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor domestic assault charge in Minnesota after bruises were found on Abigail at school. Sarah admitted to spanking the child. She received community service and probation, but the family was allowed to keep all 6 children. They moved to Oregon. Then they moved again to Woodland, Washington, each relocation seemingly timed to stay ahead of scrutiny. The neighbors at their final home in Washington, Bruce and Dana DeKalb, became increasingly alarmed. In 2017, one of the Hart daughters, Hannah, appeared at their door at 1:30 in the morning, begging for protection and saying her parents were abusing her. After that incident, Devante began coming to the DeKalb home regularly, asking for food and pleading with them not to tell Jennifer. He told the neighbors his mother's withheld food as punishment. The DeKalbs reported the family to both police and Washington State Child Protective Services. Caseworkers attempted to visit the Hart home on March 23, 2018. Nobody answered the door. 3 days later, in the early morning darkness of March 26, 2018, Jennifer Hart pulled the family's GMC Yukon onto a gravel turnout along California State Route 1, a winding stretch of Pacific Coast Highway in Mendocino County, about 200 miles north of San Francisco. The vehicle sat 70 feet from the edge of a 100-foot cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Then, with the throttle pressed to 100%, Jennifer accelerated the vehicle from a dead stop, reaching roughly 90 miles per hour in seconds, and without once touching the brakes, drove her entire family off the edge and into the rocks below. Jennifer and Sarah were both killed instantly. The bodies of Marcus, Jeremiah, and Abigail were found near the wreckage. Sierra's body was pulled from the ocean nearly 2 weeks later. Hannah's remains were eventually identified through DNA. Devante's body was never recovered, though he is legally presumed dead. Toxicology reports revealed that Jennifer, who was at the wheel, had a blood alcohol level above the legal limit. Friends had previously described Jennifer as someone who rarely drank, leading investigators to speculate that she may have been drinking specifically to build up the nerve to go through with what she was about to do. Sarah had an extraordinary 42 doses of diphenhydramine, the active ingredient in Benadryl, in her system. 2 of the children also had high levels of the drug. Recovered data from Sarah's phone painted a devastating picture of the couple's final hours. In the time before the crash, Sarah had searched the internet for information about the lethality of Benadryl, what it feels like to drown, and whether drowning is painful. She had also searched for no-kill shelters for dogs. The family's 2 dogs were found safe at the Hart home in Washington. They had made arrangements for the animals, but not for the 6 human beings in their care. GPS data from the family's vehicle, which was tracked through an insurance monitoring device, showed that the Harts left their Washington home at 8:30 in the evening on March 23rd, the same day Child Protective Services had knocked on their door and gotten no answer. They drove north on Interstate 5, then west toward the coast, stopping at a Walmart for 18 minutes. Investigators believed this was where they purchased the generic Benadryl later found in the vehicle. The family then stopped at a river near the mouth of the Columbia River for nearly 2 hours, a pause that investigators found significant but could not fully explain. From there, they drove south into California, and at some point, the GPS tracking device was turned off for the first time since installation. The Harts drove through the night. They stopped in Fort Bragg, California, and then continued north along the coast. And then Jennifer pulled onto that gravel turnout. Nobody in the vehicle was wearing a seatbelt, a detail that struck investigators as particularly telling, because friends had described Jennifer as someone who refused to drive unless everyone was buckled in. Everything about the crash pointed to premeditation. A 14-member coroner's jury unanimously ruled the deaths a murder-suicide. One juror told reporters afterward that reaching the verdict wasn't the hard part. Dealing with the whole tragedy was the hard part. The California Highway Patrol investigator assigned to the case summarized what he believed happened with a single, devastating observation. He said the Harts had decided that if they couldn't have their kids, nobody was going to have those kids. Jennifer had intentionally killed her wife and all 6 of their adopted children, rather than face the consequences of the abuse investigation that was closing in on them. The Hart case shattered any remaining illusion that a family's public image can be trusted as a reflection of its private reality. Jennifer and Sarah had spent years constructing a narrative of love and social justice, using their adopted black children as both props and shields. They moved states to avoid scrutiny. They isolated the children from extended family, from schools, and from anyone who might ask questions. And when the walls finally began to close in, they chose annihilation over accountability. The viral photo of Devante hugging that police officer, once celebrated as a symbol of hope, became in retrospect a portrait of a child trapped in a nightmare, crying not for the state of the world, but for himself. Every family we've talked about tonight carried a secret that, when finally exposed, forced the rest of us to confront an uncomfortable truth. We want to believe that families are safe. We want to believe that the people who smile at us from photos, who wave from front porches, who appear on our social media feeds with their arms around their children, are who they appear to be. But these cases remind us that the face a family shows. The world is not always the face it wears behind closed doors. And sometimes, by the time anyone sees the truth, it is already far too late. If these stories moved you, or if you found yourself thinking about them long after hearing them, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue telling these stories and making sure these victims are never forgotten. Thank you for listening. and I'll see you in the next one.